Hey everyone, Tim Wright here, pastor of Community of Grace Lutheran Church in Peoria, Arizona. And so glad to have you with us today for a very, very important topic. I've got a couple special guests with us today. And before I introduce them to you, let me read a couple things for you that are really fresh. We set up this conversation about a month ago, but yesterday and today, the topic of anti-Semitism hit the news once again. So let me read for you something that was in USA Today. This was in yesterday's paper, and then it was also carried in our Arizona Republic. More than 3/4 of American Jews feel less safe as a Jewish person in the U.S., and nearly half have changed their behavior as a result, according to a report on anti-Semitism released Tuesday by the American Jewish Committee. Couple just little quick things that they had there. More than 6 in 10, 63% of Jewish adults describe their community status in the U.S. as less secure than a year ago. Of course, a lot of this has been brought on by the war in Israel, between Israel and Palestine. An increase of more than 20 percentage points, the report said. 19% said businesses in their community had been targeted for anti-Semitism in the past 5 years. And then today I was watching a British newscast, and they just released their statistics today. They've seen a 147% increase in anti-Semitism in England. In 2022, they had 2,000 reported cases. In 2023, 4,000 reported cases. And every police precinct in all of England has had at least one report of anti-Semitism this year. It's the first time ever. And so this is an issue that's been going on for a long, long time. And it doesn't seem to get quite the attention oftentimes that maybe issues of racism do in our country. And so wanted to talk about it today. And just so people sort of know my background, I grew up in a place called St. Louis Park, Minnesota, which was 30 to 40% Jewish population. So all of my friends were Jewish, and it was just normal. We bought our musical instruments from Leo Fine, who was this great entrepreneur. I worked at Saul's Superette, and Saul was this big Jewish guy who had a horrible singing voice and sang nonstop all the time. And some of the best delicatessens that you can imagine. And my dad, every day, he would hang out at the delicatessens with his buddies. So one of the things that we joked about with my Jewish friends was they always got their Jewish holidays off from school and the Christian holidays off. We thought, wow, that's a pretty good deal. And of course, I don't know how often the buses would pull up after school to pick the kids up for Torah school. So that was just a normal part of my life. And then I moved here. And most of the people that I came in contact with had never met a Jewish person before, which was just stunning to me. So I have a real passion for this topic because so many of my friends growing up were Jewish. And of course, my good friend Michael Gurian is Jewish, both in terms of his legacy, his ethnicity, and his faith. And so, Michael, you and I have been friends for a long, long time. We do a podcast together, the Wonder Parenting Podcast. We've known each other over 17 years. We've had a chance to talk about this a few times on the podcast. Would you please introduce your rabbi to us? We're really honored to have her with us today.
Yes, so I am honored to introduce Rabbi Tamar Molino, who is the rabbi here in Spokane, Washington, for Temple Beth Shalom and actually Congregation Emmanuel, right? So a conservative and a reform, and she's really a unifier in our community, a great teacher, beloved in our community, and knows and lived in Israel for quite a while and just really knows everything about this topic. So Rabbi Tamar Molino, to the world.
Thank you very much. What a generous introduction. Thank you, Michael. And it's really a pleasure to be here with you.
So Tamar, I've been to your synagogue twice. Michael brought me there many, many years ago to observe a bar mitzvah because we were working on rites of passage. And interestingly, in all the years that I lived in St. Louis Park and all of my buddies were Jewish, I never was invited to a bar mitzvah. So that was the first one I went to.
Wow. Okay.
And then I was there just a few months ago for Michael's wife's funeral.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
And so I want to kind of start there because every time you get together, you're reminded that you're not always safe. I was, even at Gail's funeral, you had a police officer there. So Tamar, let's just start there a little bit. Why is it that's happening?
Right. We actually have officers in our outside our building 4 times a week. Every time we meet, Friday night, Saturday morning for worship services, and Wednesday for Hebrew school, and Sunday morning for religious school. So, we're very concerned about security. There's been enough attacks on, the famous attack in the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, where there was a shooting inside the synagogue a few years ago, hostage taking situation in Colleyville, Texas, some anti-Semitic graffiti at our building. Fortunately, that happened while there was no one actually physically in the building, which is a relief, even though it was upsetting for sure. That there have been enough instances of anti-Semitic attacks towards synagogues that we feel like that's something we need to have regularly. And of course, in our neck of the woods, there were also the Aryan nations that were down the road outside of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, that had it in for our synagogue for quite a number of years, even though they probably still exist, but they're not organized as a group anymore. But I imagine they're out there still.
I think it's hard for many of us. I'll talk now as a person of faith in the Christian world. We have had to deal with issues of security on a certain level just because the world's become such a violent place. But you have to do it because it's just an ongoing threat to the Jewish people. And so every time you get together, and again, as I said, to even go to a funeral where you have to have an officer there, it shouldn't be like that, but it is. Can you tell us a little bit, and then I'll get to Michael, how you have personally experienced anti-Semitism in your life?
That maybe is too long answer for this podcast, but I'll try to narrow it a little bit. I grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina, very much part of the Bible Belt, and from a minority Jewish community, and from a pretty young age, experienced various things, other kids in my class telling me I was going to hell because I didn't believe in Jesus, kids asking me if I had horns, kids asking me if I practiced witchcraft. All of that was kind of just the background of my childhood in a certain way. And also, of course, the Klan was active then too in North Carolina. So I have some pretty vivid memories of dealing with that and protesting with my family and other members of my community protesting the Klan. So that's just so really, in a certain sense, it was a given that it would be part of most of my life as an active present Jewish person in America. As an adult, I've had in some ways the privilege to work in Jewish communities most of my career. So in a certain sense, it's sort of funny because I don't interact with large segments of the non-Jewish population on a regular basis. My daily life is very much ensconced in the Jewish community. So on some level, I feel a little bit personally insulated, but I also feel like as a public representative of the Jewish community in Spokane, as our security consultant once said to me, "You have a target on your back." I was like, I know. So I do, look over my shoulder a fair amount, whether I want to or not.
Yeah. It's hard for me as a person of faith, a pastor, a Lutheran pastor, to understand that kind of vitriol coming from Christian people. I know it happens because we have such close ties to our Jewish friends in terms of our faith together. However, I come from a denomination, the Lutheran Church. Martin Luther started the Protestant Reformation, and near the end of his life became just a violent anti-Semite. And the Lutheran Church has publicly apologized for that, and we have had really good working relationships with people of Jewish faith and Jewish organizations. But still, it come from religious people, you just sort of scratch your head. And yet religion has been used many, many times over the course of human history, especially in the last 2,000 years, to sort of justify this antagonism toward Jewish people. Michael, I know that you've experienced it. You've talked about it before with me. Tell us a little bit about some of what you've experienced.
Well, more like Rabbi Tamar, when I was a kid, like we lived in Laramie, Wyoming, that was a place where, very small Jewish population. And I've told that story before. I think of the guys getting me, I was in 7th grade, getting me behind the school and using pliers to pull on my nose to see if it would grow even bigger, So things like that, which I definitely remember. Also, like Rabbi Tamar, I was back when the Aryan nations were here. We marched at least once a year, if I recall, maybe more. We marched, and we would march from Coeur d'Alene, back toward Post Falls. And these are just towns here where there was a big march against them. And people, thankfully, were very united, most people, against what the Aryan nations were doing. But that was an example of where, wow, they were just viciously anti-Semitic as well as racist. And but then for me as an adult, in the years that I raised my children, let's say with Gail, I didn't experience much myself. So not as an adult or a middle-aged person, or even now an elder, I don't experience much anti-Semitism. But I'm shocked when I read about it. And being part of the temple community and being on committees there, we would always have these arguments. Well, so much of our money goes to paying for this security. It's very costly, and okay, do we need it? But then people would, people who were in the meetings would say, yeah, but my child, experienced this, or this just happened, or like what Rabbi referred to as the graffiti that was, the swastikas and all that put on our walls. So, how can you not? I mean, it's definitely everywhere. I'm just lucky that as an adult, I have not experienced what I experienced as a kid.
Yeah. Tamar, can you sort of give us some perspective? We talk about racism, we talk about anti-Semitism. They're similar. How would you define anti-Semitism, say, as opposed to racism and in relationship to racism?
So this is one of the main challenges, I think, because the construction of Jewish identity and what it means to be Jewish is more ancient than the concept of racism in the modern world and how we understand it. So people are Jewish by virtue of their ethnicity and their birth into a certain ethnicity, right? People are Jewish because they choose to convert to Judaism for religious reasons. And people are Jewish without being religious, but identify with the Jewish people or a Jewish nationhood in terms of the state of Israel. So there's a lot of different aspects of Jewish identity, and anti-Semitism addresses can kind of address any of those identities at any given aspects of Jewish identity at any given moment. So that's why it's a little bit complex. One of the great thinkers of the 20th and early 21st centuries, Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who was the chief rabbi of Great Britain for a time and wrote really beautifully lots of interesting things. But he talked about anti-Semitism as a virus that mutates depending on the circumstance, that it manifests as a hatred of Jews, but it mutates in the way that it's addressed. One of the things that we, obviously in terms of the Nazis and the Nazi era, Jews were understood to be a race, right? And it was about Jewish blood. And so if you had Jewish blood, you were murdered, intended to be murdered in the camps. And they defined that as you had to have one Jewish grandparent, and then you were considered Jew. You had enough Jewish blood to need to be killed. So that was their definition of Judaism, or of what it means to be Jewish. But of course, that's not really accurate in terms of how we understand Jewish identity today. So it's a complex issue. And it's also true that Jews, especially now, but always was true, look incredibly different from each other, right? There are Ethiopian Jews who are Black, and there are lots and lots of Jews from Middle Eastern countries who are not physically distinguishable from their Arab neighbors, or the Arabs that they grew up around. They speak Arabic. There's like this very broad range. And of course, we also have folks who convert to Judaism. So, one of the very active members of our congregation is a Chinese American who converted to Judaism. So she looks Chinese. So you just can't automatically say, it's not a race, right? Jews are not a race. And that's very clear, even though there is there can be an ethnicity that's passed down from generation to generation. So it gets a little sticky because the categories don't exactly fit when we talk about racism being a prejudice or a bigotry against somebody because of how their skin color. That doesn't really fit in terms of anti-Semitism, but there is no question that there's anti-Semitism that has to do with, physical characteristics like big noses or the way that the Nazis understood anti-Semitism. That's kind of one of the other points that Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks makes, is that, there's anti-Semitism that's related to religion, which you could renounce your religion, right, and convert to another religion, and then supposedly that anti-Semitism disappears. But then there's anti-Semitism that's related to, what they characterize as race or ethnicity. You can't change your race or ethnicity, so that was much more deadly in terms of what the Nazis envisioned for their project. So it just varies. It's hard to pinpoint, and that's one of the reasons that makes it hard to address and fight, and also hard to recognize in the context of us focusing as a country on issues of race and needing to redress issues of racism.
Yeah, it does seem that we know it's there, we hear about it, but we don't really seem to have the national outrage that can come with these moments like we have with George Floyd, for example. And I understand that the history of our African American friends is somewhat different, coming in, not being able to vote and being held as slaves and so on. And Jewish people come in from a whole different perspective. But I'll just have you speak for yourself. Do you sometimes feel like the country doesn't really take it seriously enough?
I do often. And I think, part of that is related to this issue of like, how do you define who's a Jew? How do you define anti-Semitism? But I do, and especially with regard to the current situation and all the anti-Semitism that's arisen in response to the war in Israel and Gaza, it feels even louder and even of greater concern. One of the, if your folks are interested in Googling, Chuck Schumer gave a tremendous address in the Senate, I don't know, probably 2 months ago, about anti-Semitism in America. And he took a risk to speak personally because he's Jewish. And he basically said, I'm the highest ranking Jewish person in the American government. And so I feel like I need to say this. And he outlined some of the issues. And he basically said, for most of the country, they think it's like a smoldering ember. And for Jews, they feel like it's a 5-alarm fire. And I think that, if your folks are interested, it's up on easy to find that speech. But he really outlines some of the concerns I think that many of us in the Jewish community are feeling on a regular basis. It takes a second on social media to end up with anti-Semitic websites and posts and all of that. And there's lots of research, of course, that talks about how quickly you get directed to those things, even if you search minimally for what you're looking for across social media. So it's very prevalent in communications and social media. We had an instance a few, 2 months ago or so. There was a letter to the editor in the Spokane paper that made it into the Spokane paper, completely bypassed the people who were editing that page. And it was horribly anti-Semitic. It sort of tapped into those conspiracy theories about how Jews control the world and evil Zionists pulling strings from the shadows. It was actually a literal quote from the letter. And somehow past this, no one noticed, and it made its way into the paper. Of course, they printed an apology and everything, but that's indicative of how people are not conscious, I think, of the degree to which there is anti-Semitism at this point in the water in the United States. And it's a little terrifying, it's a little terrifying.
So Michael, Tamar gives us a perspective as a leader of the Jewish community, your Jewish community in particular. So when you hear these stories as a Jewish person, what are your responses? What's going through your mind these days?
The stories of like what came in the Spokesman Review?
Yeah, and just these growing numbers of anti-Semitic images and so on.
Yeah, it's just a head shaker to me. I mean, things I believe we're getting better. I think social media is playing a part because if I go back 10 years, if I go back 20 years into raising my kids, I mean, there wasn't as much of this going on, and I think to some extent it wasn't going on because there wasn't the extreme polls of social media, and then all the algorithms and all these ways that people who, anti-Semitic people have always existed, like racist people have always existed, but it wasn't like in the last few years. And then, of course, since October 7th, even more. But even 2, 3, 4 years ago, it started to grow. We started to see more of it. And I think to a great extent, we're seeing more of it because people are coming out of the woodwork and they have availability via social media, to create a little tribe and to do their conspiracy theories. And as they suffer, I mean, this is something I've thought about with anti-Semitism quite a bit. As a human being suffers, they always look for a scapegoat. It's unfortunately natural to a kind of brainstem reaction. And they don't get up to the frontal lobe, right? They just kind of are midbrain and lower brain. And this is what they've heard this somewhere. Jews are bad. They've heard it. They grab it. That's their scapegoat. And then they just keep pursuing it until it makes absolute sense to them. And of course, nothing really that they accuse Jews of have the Jews done, and certainly not done to anyone near them. But they're then locked in. And I think social media is really exacerbating them and locking these people in, because there are unhappy people in the world, and they are looking for why they are unhappy, and this is one of the things they can find. They can find racism, they can find anti-Semitism, and they settle on it and they use it. And it's really not linked to reality. And then since October 7th, I mean, I and my family and people have been touched, because now via social media, like my kids have lost friends because their friends, who are usually on the left, have grabbed a hold of stuff that also isn't real. That Israel is a fascistic state that's a Zionist, blah, 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 all the things, and that the Palestinians, have never had any animus to Israel, and it's really all Israel, and it's an apartheid, right? And so this extreme thing came about, and they've got friends who have been retweeting stuff that was anti-Semitic, and they go to their friends and they say, I got to explain this to you. Let's talk about it. That's really anti-Semitic. It's not true. It's really bad. Please don't retweet that. And the friends are like, oh, well, it's the other side of it. But it's actually not. It's a false equivalency, because what it is lies and untrue and all that. And then they try to repair it, and the friendships die away because these people are doing something that's a direct affront. It feels really unsafe and bad to my kids. And the friends won't back off, and then they've lost friendships. And it shouldn't be that way. That is an example of where social media has just is not working in reality. And then people are buying in, and then they're farming their tribe around stuff that's not real. And I remember talking to one of them where that person said, I actually was able to talk to her because I know her, and she said, well, the Palestinians don't support Hamas and don't support this. The Palestinians are 100%, ready for a two-state solution, and it's really Hamas, and so, et cetera. And I had to say, well, Palestinians voted for Hamas, and 70% to 80% of Palestinians support Hamas and what Hamas is doing. So this really is, something deep is going on here, and it's not the enemies you think it is, and it requires a compromise that isn't going to be helped by this anti-Semitism. But it didn't work, and so now I'm not friends with that person anymore. So to add to the puzzle, I would say that social media, if people could stay off social media, I think they would be less anti-Semitic, and we would have less anti-Semitism.
And that would be probably the same for less racism as well, right? All those algorithms built into that same thing. Well, you both have been so really gracious in talking about some of the heartache. And of course, this is a story that Jewish people have lived with almost from time before time, right? Your whole history is sort of rooted in the Exodus story and captivity in Babylon and under Greek and Romans and Persians and then of course the Nazi era and it's just been one tale after another of a persecuted people. Tamar, what, as a rabbi and as a Jewish person, what do you want us to know? How can we be supportive of our Jewish neighbors?
Thank you for that question. I want to kind of go back a little bit to what Michael said just for a moment. I think part of the danger of social media is that it erases the nuance and the complexity of the issues around Israel and Palestine. And that is what's so hard, that it's very possible to be pro-Palestinian and not be anti-Semitic, but not in the way that is portrayed over social media, and that conversation takes place. And so that's really complicated. And it so often devolves into anti-Semitism, and it's really horrible. And many members of our community have experienced, Michael, what you've described with your daughters and their friends. And that's very tough because people aren't able to parse that and figure out where they can parse the line about saying something sophisticated about what's happening in the Middle East and not be anti-Semitic, because it is possible to do that. So maybe I want to jump on that bandwagon and say, really, really watch yourself on social media. And that's one of the ways we can help prevent the spread of anti-Semitism. I think, it's always about speaking out. If you see it, if you hear it, call it out. And not just when you're worried that there's going to be a Jewish person looking over your shoulder, but when you're having conversations with people that you know and care about, and that you have relationships that you want to sustain. It's so important. It is like, there's a way in which it's also, racism, one of the most powerful ways that I've understood it, right, is that we have these implicit biases, and we have to kind of continuously look out for the things that we say and the ways that we interact with other people to not promote racism, even though our intentions may be really good. And I think that's also true about anti-Semitism. It's a similar thing about being conscious of the ways in which we might, kind of promote whatever the manifestation is in the moment, without even intending to, with very good intent, but kind of buying into whatever the stereotype is without kind of exploring our own backgrounds and consciousness of it. So that's really what I would say. I think it's both a self-reflective aspect of kind of trying to figure out where the anti-Semitic parts of us are, and Jews are not exempt from that, by the way, and kind of and trying to root those out of the way that we conceive of ourselves, the way we conceive of others, and then also just in the ways in which we see it manifesting around us to call it out the best we can.
Well, I appreciate so much the time that both of you have given. It really is such a complex topic in many ways, and yet a very simple one in others, that both our Jewish faith, our Christian faith, are based on loving our neighbors as we love ourselves. And it doesn't matter who that neighbor is, doesn't matter whether we agree or not agree. The unique message of the Jewish faith has always been to love neighbors, and to see neighbors as created in the image of God. That was just radically Jewish message. And so maybe we could all learn something from our Jewish friends about treating people with dignity and respect, and that includes our Jewish friends. So thank you very, very much, both of you, for your time. And for those of you who are watching, we hope that you'll continue to look into these topics and be an advocate for anybody who is mistreated and lacks the sort of support that they need in this world. So thank you both very, very much.
Thank you for having me.